La vida es corta sin parar, mirar y de reír para celebrar. Cada momento hay que gozar, como si mañana no va a llegar.
Hola, hola. Welcome to Entre Tías y Amiguis, the podcast where we dive into the wild roller coaster ride of adulting. I'm your host, Audrey Rodriguez, a queer Salvadorian native, a first-gen trailblazer, a multipreneur and licensed psychotherapist, here to share wisdom, stories, and real talk with my tías and amiguis and other incredible guests who inspire and uplift our community. I want to remind you that while I am a licensed psychotherapist, this podcast is for informational and entertainment purposes only. The discussions we have here are not substitute for professional mental health advice, diagnosis, or treatment. Now let's dive into today's conversation and explore the journey of adulting together. Grab your cafecito, get comfy, and let's get started. Welcome to another episode of Entre Tías y Amiguis. I'm your host, Audrey Rodriguez. My pronouns are she, her, hers, ella. And you know how I always start with reminding everybody that the way that our intersections of our identity really matter because they inform like the lens of how we live life, right? And so for me, being queer, being Salvadorian, being an immigrant, being a daughter of immigrants, all those things inevitably create a lens, right? That I'm a psychotherapist through, that I am a friend through, like there's like all these ways that our identities show up. And so I always start there, and I always invite my guests to sort of think about like, what are some of those lenses that inform the experiences, the relationships that they're in. And so today I have a very special guest. After saying hello, this is my dear, dear friend Stella. And one of the very special things, fun things about having a podcast is that I get to invite like all the people that I love and know. But something that is really special about you is that like we've become adults together. We have been friends for 18 years. And it's wild to think it's 18 years because it's the entire journey of adulthood. We've experienced it. And so to be here, having a conversation that I know we've had offline, but it is something different to capture it in time. So I'm really excited. And so why don't you begin by introducing yourself to our audience?
Well, I'm really excited to be here, as you mentioned. So for everyone that is listening, my name is Esthela Duran. I am one of your closest friends and confidants, I want to say. So I'm really excited to be here. I think that we've had really, really good conversations about your podcast, about the conversation that we're going to have today. I think that we've had them offline, like you said, and we really have had them through almost the last 2 decades. It sounds crazy. I know you would never think it. We look like babies, Botox, but, and I think it's important to have these conversations. I think that it's important that you have this platform, and I'm so excited that you have opened this platform for anyone that might be having this conversation, maybe with other friends, and more importantly, maybe for someone that is having some of these thoughts, but they don't have that person to have these conversations with. So a little bit about me, for, again, anyone that doesn't know me, I am a realtor by day, but let's go back a little bit. I was born in a very small town in Michoacán, Mexico, small, traditional, very conservative. I am a daughter. I am a little sister. I immigrated to California when I was 5 years old. So I started kindergarten here, and have been in Northern California ever since. So Sacramento has been my home, which I love. But really, when I look back at some of the immigrant story that I had, or really that time in my life, I really think that actually was maybe the beginning of what I now call my nonlinear life, right? Because when I look back at it, being 5 years old and immigrating, really put me in this middle category where I wasn't first generation, but I also really couldn't relate to a lot of people that had immigrated here, because a lot of the time when I came across someone, they were typically maybe a little bit older, maybe parents. In fact, to this day, I can have really good conversations with the parents of my friends because we can relate on some of that immigrant struggle, right? And so I think that was really the beginning of it. And, again, we've talked a little bit about my nonlinear life and how I got here, but really I think that was the beginning of it as I see things now.
Yeah, I mean, like, I think that that's one of the parts in our friendship is that we can like jump in and out of like the different parts of us, you know, as immigrants, as people that have this very unique experience with their family, but that also went to school here and have become business owners, have become like career people, right? Like we have like this jumping in and out constantly. And so living this non-linear life, the way that you're kind of framing it, I know that I relate to that feeling too, right? And so what are you exactly talking about? Like walk us through kind of, you talk about being an immigrant at 5 years old, not being quite first gen, but also not quite being like a full immigrant, you know, because we're a kid, right? So walk us through like, how are you framing this idea of like the nonlinear life? What does it mean to you?
So the nonlinear life, really, it has a few different categories when I think about my nonlinear life. One of those things is I don't fit specifically, and throughout my life, I have noticed that I don't fit to very specific boxes. And at first, to be 100% honest with you, it was really hard. It was hard when I was younger and I didn't really, I wasn't at that stage then of self-discovery, right? Or really aware of what that meant. But a lot of the times in not fitting into specific boxes, it really had me feeling, is there a place for me? What is that place for me? As I've gotten older, which is one of those things, you know, that saying, más sabe el diablo por viejo que por diablo. As you get older and you go through this wonderful thing called life, you do find out a lot about yourself. You go through this journey. You have to be open to it, of course. But as I have now over the last couple of decades really discovered who I am, I have found that I live a nonlinear life, but not looking at my life in a timeline of what comes next or what I think a lot of it would be like a societal norm. Also a cultural norm for me specifically. Like I was mentioning, I do come from a very, very conservative town. And so finding out that I really wanted to just live my life on my terms, go on my journey, do a lot of self-discovery, and find the life events that or go on the life events that I wanted to go on and not necessarily look at life in milestones, right? Or in this very linear way of you graduate high school. If you want to go to school, and you graduate, you go to school, you're done in about 4 years, sometimes 5, in my case, 5.5. And also I didn't go straight to school. I took a year off to kind of find out what I wanted to do with my life. Again, not easy to explain to parents that came to this country knowing we want something better for you. And a lot of the times that I want something better for you looks very linear. It looks like you're going to graduate, you're going to go off to school, you're going to know what you want to do with your life, and then you're going to get a job and you're going to do this and then you're going to get married. Specifically, when I look at my background and when I think about other people that I know within my hometown or people that have immigrated here, my sister and I are the very first ones within like my parents' group of friends from our town that decided that they were going to go to school. Most you get married, I want to say probably late teens, young adults, early 20s. In our hometown, most people will get married at like 18, 19 years old. And so having that conversation with my parents was hard, but it was something that I knew that I wanted to do because I knew that, I do want to go to school eventually, but I want to find out what I want to do. I want to find out, do I want to move away? Do I want to stay in Sacramento? I ended up staying ultimately in Sacramento, and it was a great decision. But I wanted to come to terms with that decision by myself, for myself, right? And so having those thoughts then, and now looking at what my life has looked like over the last 2 decades since I've made that decision, I'm so happy that I did. And that was the beginning of looking at life in, I want to do the things that I want to do, and I want to explore life the way that I want to explore life, and not follow certain timelines, which over the last couple of years specifically has gotten a little harder because being a woman, sometimes does come with a timeline. But really, I think when I talk about my nonlinear life, it's been exactly just that. Mm-hmm. Finding out that I wanted to live my life based on my wants and my needs in my own terms, and not necessarily based on a timeline and on the here's what's supposed to come next. That society, that people, that sometimes our background tells us that's what's supposed to come next. Mm-hmm. That's not the life that I knew I didn't want to live, and it's not the life that I want to live.
What it makes me think about, like right at the beginning, as you started explaining your non-linear life, you talked though about that feeling of otherness, right? Like now, two decades later, we're like thriving and loving, like, oh yeah, like actually this was exactly what I wanted to do and how I imagined, how I wanted it to be. But there was a long time that I know I didn't have language or, like even the internal permission to say like this is okay, that it felt like an other. It felt like, oh, like I'm not seeing it happen, like I'm pushing this way, everybody's going this way, I hope it's okay, I hope people are gonna be able to accept it. But there is a big period of that until you figured out that this is exactly what you wanted, that there is this otherness, and that maybe some of you folks that are thinking about like, I'm not following the traditional path that either my parents explicitly or with their hopes and aspirations sort of inculcaron, right? Like they put into you, or that society has said, like, you do this and then you do that in order to be a good person, a good woman, right? Like you do this and then you do that. And so the feeling of otherness, I think, is like a very normal and natural, like step into this nonlinear life. And it's also like, maybe for those of you that are like in the 2 decades before getting to this moment, right? Like that this otherness feeling, that it does, that I hope it doesn't discourage people from wanting to continue to explore living life on their own terms, because it can feel like a big load when you're like the only one that is not following the path. And so, what kind of messages were you receiving? Were your parents or your family very directly saying like, this is what we expect from you? Or how did they convey to you that they expected certain things from you as you became an adult?
So a couple of things that I want to kind of mention from what you just touched on. Mm-hmm. One is really, and we were talking about this the last time that I saw you, is for anyone listening, yes, now 2 decades later, after a lot of work, because it was a lot of work, and I mean that in various ways, and a lot of self-discovery, like I have mentioned, I feel like, yes, I'm in a place that I love, I'm thriving, I'm living. But yes, there were moments that were rough as you're going through this journey. I mean, spoiler alert for anyone listening, it's going to be okay, right? Yes. And like, it's going to be okay. Yeah, we're talking lows, and we're talking lows, highs, but we're talking lows and lows. And some of that does come exactly from that, I was mentioning that I had that conversation with my parents of, I know that I want to go to school. I know that I'm going to go to school, but I need to figure out what exactly the next step looks like for me before I do that, because that's what I want. And so one of the things that I'm very grateful for is, I have said it many times, and I've been very open about the fact that I grew up in a bit of a dysfunctional household, very loving, strict. My parents' relationship was dysfunctional, but one of the things that I think that they did very well was that they always had this, and it was hard then, and it's sometimes even hard now to navigate this is how we know life is. This is how we grew up, because we would go to Mexico every year. And so I was very much still a part of that community. But my parents were always very open to the idea of, yes, this is the way that maybe we see life, not necessarily the way that you need to see life, right? And so I'm grateful for that, because I do think that even though we didn't have the extensive conversations, or they don't have really the ability to package it all up and give that to me and my sister, I do think, and I did see in them, I never heard, when are you going to get married? I never heard we want to be grandparents. You need to have kids. I never heard that from them. But I did hear it from some of their friends. And I did hear it when we went to Mexico. Everyone always asked. Some people, as we got older, were always very curious about, they're not married, like what's going on. And I think that my parents navigated that well, but it is in a way something that when you are part of a community where that is the norm, it's going to be difficult to navigate, and it's going to be hard conversations, and it's going to be sometimes a feeling of maybe I don't belong to what I think is my community, and that is going to be hard. And as you get older, again, this is the part that also, you get older and you start also feeling, at least for me, and I'm sure that we've had this conversation many times, there was a lot of the nonlinear life starts maybe in the home or with your family, but it also goes into your peers and your friends, especially as you start getting older and people start getting engaged, start getting married, right? You start, right? And so, for anyone that doesn't know, I didn't get married until my 10th anniversary. So it took 10 years. For anyone listening, it's probably someone right now just went, gasp. Because for most people, you're probably thinking, why? Like, that's such a long time. Yeah. And it's something that when I look back now, I'm glad that I didn't get married younger. I think getting married at the age that I got married, which was in my early 30s, really allowed me to, one, know that I wanted to get married. Right. And to have a better definition of what I wanted out of a marriage. I think that I could have gotten married younger. I know, my husband and I had that conversation years before we actually got engaged about thinking about getting married. And I think it was because at that time, there was a lot. I mean, I lost count of how many times people would ask, like, when are you guys getting engaged? When are you guys getting married? People even asked when we were going to have kids before we got married. Yeah. Like people literally would just ask like, oh, when are you going to start having kids? Yeah. Right. Because we had been together for a long time. So yeah.
What my mind goes is like this idea that like when the people that you're around are living this very traditional linear lives, right? In this otherness, it's almost like they start worrying about like, are you okay that you're not following this like path? Yeah. Are you sure that this doesn't mean something bad, right? And I think that is like a part that when you're younger in your earlier 20s, or like that, when you're becoming an adult, if you're still having that doubt in yourself and then other people are putting the doubt, then I think that's where so many of us maybe hit our first like bouts of depression or bouts of like existential crisis, because there is this like before having this conversation, right? Like we've talked about it, but today we're calling it a nonlinear life. And we're like, yeah, that's what we've lived, right? But for a long time, we've had the same conversation of being like, dang, like,
what are we doing?
What are we doing? Like, what is this expectation? Right? And so the reassurance of, am I okay if I'm not following the path, not only internally, but then when people are challenging you and like continuing to remind you that you're not living according to like what's expected of you, like that puts a tremendous pressure inside of us.
Yeah, it does. It really does. And I think, and what I'm about to say next, again, for anyone listening, take it with a grain of salt. I'm only here to talk about my life. Yeah. So one of the things that I noticed in looking at specifically, I want to say the last decade or so, is as some of these things started becoming more, I want to say the best word is obvious. I'm probably not following this.
Yeah. But at this point, it's safe to say, we're not going to meet the milestone. Sorry, y'all.
Yeah, yes, exactly, right? The life events on the way that most people would picture it. Yeah. So one of the things that I think was around 10 years ago very hard when it started becoming very obvious was these conversations. And as I started specifically thinking of, I think the way that I see my life, which is very much the life that I have now, it became a lot harder to have certain conversations with people without feeling like the other, without maybe feeling a little bit judged. But one of the things that happens, and I think it's as you get a little older, and once you really discover who you are and what you want out of life and what you like and what you don't like, is that you're able to really look at relationships. And this is all relationships, with family, with friends, romantic relationships, and really sit there and say, aquí no es. Okay. Like, and it's not, I'm not telling anyone to just go down your list and start cutting people out. If you want to do that, I support it as well. But sometimes as you're growing and as you're finding out who you are, I think that if you're having these conversations that are very true to you, that you're showing up in your most authentic way and you're not feeling welcome, ahí no es. And it's time to maybe, and it's not necessarily like, oh, we've been friends for 10, 20 years, but now I don't find a connection. I'm not saying delete them off of your social media and never text them or call them again, but really start finding out what friends are going to be part of this new you, this new life that you have. And sometimes that does mean your circle starts getting a little bit smaller. You maybe start losing a relationship with family members, and it's going to be hard. It's not easy. Because again, one of the things that happens as you're finding yourself is that you start learning what feels good, what doesn't feel good. And sometimes family members don't always make you feel good, right? And as you get older, you decide, hey, this is really, it's not for me. It's not a relationship that makes me feel good. It's not a relationship that makes me feel fulfilled, and that makes me feel like I'm living the life that I want to live. So, again, take it with a grain of salt. But it is important to also analyze and look at some of those relationships, right? And I think that it's 100% okay to have different lifestyles or and have different ideas, have different opinions. But if at the end of the day, those friendships or relationships don't make you feel good about the life that you want to live or who you are, probably not a relationship that should be a priority for you to continue.
Yeah, I mean, it's like what comes to my mind is like this idea of like being able to hold the nuance, right? Like to me, I'm like, you want to have kids, you want to get married, you want to do this, like good for you, like that's your life.
1,000%, yeah.
But where it becomes like this feeling of otherness or like this feeling of like discomfort or judgment, right, is when their values, family members, friends, become the measurement or like are you hitting that milestone? Like, for example, we had, 7 years ago, everybody that we knew got married. Like,
I'm going to say about 10 years ago.
10 years ago now?
Yeah.
10 years ago, yeah, because pre-pandemic, all the years that we lost, right? So there was this period of life that, like, everybody got married. Yeah. And I remember I had never, like, felt like, oh, I'm going to go get married or whatever. Like, I've never been that person. But when everybody started getting married, oh my gosh, like I was just like, are we never gonna get married? Like, what does it mean? Like I had those moments and it was such a what? Like I've never cared about this, but now that I'm seeing it and now that people are starting to ask, so when are you guys gonna get married? Right? With excitement, because you love each other and because we see you happy. So like, when is your turn? Right? It was like, wait, what? Like I felt pressured without knowing that I was feeling pressured.
Yeah.
And it was like an internalized part of just like, how do I keep up with the times, like a version of keeping up with the Joneses, right?
Yep.
And, for me, like uniquely, right, being queer, being like kind of living even this other layers of like, no one in our circle was gay. No one in our circle was partnered with like somebody of the same gender, right? And so I felt like super outsider. And so I remember like the getting married was like my little bridge into coming back to like this normal expectation. And like now 10 years later, I'm like, oh my gosh, like what the heck? I'm happy I'm married and I love my life. But like thinking about it, right? It's just like when you're feeling like the other, sometimes you might feel that pressure. How do I get back into the cool kids club, right? Like I want to be part of this club that I'm feeling left out. But part of that is that when you're not having this relationships in which your otherness is just it's just okay. It's talked about in a highlight as well, right? Because in those years that we weren't getting married, we weren't, we're not having kids and things like that, right? Like, we are some of the most successful badass entrepreneurs. Like we've built some amazing lives. Yeah. We travel, we do like all these cool things, but they don't always take like the same stance as like the other type of celebrations, right? That have happened in people's lives. And so when you find other people that can hold your otherness and elevate your otherness and support you in your otherness
and just celebrate it,
gives you like that permission, like that relief of like, okay, like I can have this, non-linear life and I'm still okay and it's still gonna be fine. But it is a confusing experience when you're living it through and when you don't have the role models of people that are gonna be okay, that you're gonna be okay. And in fact, 2 weeks ago or 3 weeks ago, I went to a luncheon.
I think it was actually a month ago.
Oh my gosh, I know it's so bad. A month ago. Like I told you about it, right? I went to this luncheon and the CEO of Planned Parenthood of Northern California was doing the keynote. And then she talks about being 60 and being like living her best years. And she's like in the pinnacle of her career. And then she's like, and I chose to not have kids. And it was the best decision that I made. And I literally, right? Yeah. Like, I felt like, wait, what? Like, I'm going to be okay. Like, it's going to be fine. I'm going to still be a badass. I'm still going to be looking good as heck. Yeah. And I'm still going to be really happy and I'm going to be really proud of my choice, right? Yeah. But for a long time, I think that's my first time ever meeting a 60-year-old or seeing a 60-year-old woman saying, it's going to be okay. Yep. That this decision that I made for me, that is a similar decision that I made for myself, right? Like having that role model of just like, oh, okay, like people are all right after all, right? But like when you are going through it and everybody is living this life, you're just kind of like, having to hold on to your inner knowing is so important in this moment, right? Because it is like, you're not getting the support or the cheers from others, right? You're like, is this okay? You're in your own self-doubt. You're not having role models. And so it can be like wobbly. It can really impact your own self-esteem and your own self-view.
Yeah, no, 100%. I mean, I think, and like I said, this is for anyone listening, like I said, you are going to be okay. But it's going to take some time because it really does take finding out who you are, to have that confidence to say, this is not for me. And it's going to be hard because some of these decisions are also going to affect other people. So for example, you are going to be in a relationship where if you decide, I don't want to get married, that's going to affect the other person. But at the end of the day, it's very important to be true to yourself and have that conversation, even if it's hard, and that the other person is aware this is not the life that I see myself living. And again, it's hard. It's just, we've talked about therapy. I'm in therapy and I've been in therapy and having some realizations. It's hard. I've sat in my car after and just cried. But getting through those realizations at the end of the day helped me.
It affirms you internally.
Exactly. And that's some of the work that I was mentioning before that has gotten me to this point where I am okay. I have made decisions that I'm happy with because they are aligned with the person that I am and the person that I want to be and live the life that I want to live.
It's so cool. It's like right now it's like I'm thinking about like gratitude is giving me like gratitude of like the 20-year-olds that we when we met, like this 20-year-olds that like we knew this even without knowing it. And I'm so grateful that these younger versions of ourselves, a duras penas, right? Sometimes it's like crawling through
the low lows.
But they're like, it's like when we really listen to ourselves, we do have the answer, right? Like when we listen to like, what is the life that I want? What are the things that feel good for me? Generally, most of us have the answer, but the answer gets muffled by the noise of the outside and by the internalized pressures that some of these beliefs may not be yours, but you have heard them over and over and over, that there is like it's hard to like weed them out, what's mine and what somebody else's, what's mine and what society telling me that it should be mine. And so I'm just proud of our little 20-year-old selves that we're like, listen, and here we are. Yeah. And we are okay. Yeah. More than okay, if anything, right? Yeah. But for a long time, we did have those lows, but we always know. And I think that's a part that, kind of offering to anybody that might be questioning, am I in the right path? Am I living up to the hopes and the dreams of my parents? Am I being the type of woman that everybody expects me to be, right? Yeah. It's like, how do you go internal with a therapist? Ideally, we're going to promote therapy here. Yeah. But even just on your own, right? How do you give the space to that self-reflection of like, what do I know in my heart, in my gut, right? Like about the way that I'm choosing to live my life, because those answers, maybe some of those things are not going to get validated from the outside, but if you validate them for yourself and you hold on to them, this is how you make it to this other side. But like a sense of gratitude for like the times that we knew with that knowing that we already knew.
Yeah, 100%. And I think it's one of those things too, where, I listen to a lot of like, how do I feel? I think that I listened to that, how do I feel, when I was in my 20s. And later on, that helped me decide what I wanted, what I didn't want. But now how I feel, because we don't have this linear way or life events that happen at a certain time. So I know we had chatted about this, and, how do we then measure what feels like you've made it or a success, because you are living a nonlinear life? And it goes back to, again, how I feel. For me personally, I see my successes in not having the Monday blues. I had a corporate job, and those Monday blues were real. Now they call them the Sunday scaries. I don't think mine started really on Sunday. It was definitely on Monday. Monday. Yeah. And for anyone that doesn't know, so we actually were kind of like co-workers, not in real life, but we were on
we were Google chatting and MySpace chatting. Yes. We were like at work, logged into our MySpace and like, how's your day going? Talking about our coworkers as if we like knew them.
Yes. So the moment or really happened a lot on Mondays. Right. And so now when I look at where I'm at in life, I don't feel the Sunday scaries that they call now. I don't have the Monday blues. And the other thing is, my biggest win in life, because I'm not a morning person, is I don't have to wake up to an alarm. I don't have to wake up to an alarm. But again, that goes back to the decision that I chose to be self-employed. Yeah. And that also comes with pros and cons. And there's a lot of, when we talk about real estate, for example, there's shows that make it look so glamorous, or, there's a lot of money in it. I always talk about real estate in my life, and real estate as something that's a dreamy career. And it's not necessarily because of some of the things that you might see on TV, but it's because it has allowed me to not have to wake up to an alarm, which is huge for me. Again, I'm not a morning person, but really, like, when I think about all of the generations, or even my parents have to wake up to an alarm for, ever since they got to this country, right? And in this case, I think my dad wakes up at like 4 a.m. and my mom wakes up at 5, right? And so when I think about my life, I don't have to do that. And that's the way that I'm kind of measuring things, it's by how I feel now. So earlier years, it was feeling and knowing that I wanted certain things or I didn't want certain things. And now that same feeling or knowing how I feel about something is also allowing me to really measure a lot of these things and celebrate these things in my life.
It's choice, right? I think like the way that I measure the success is have choice, because we sometimes work on Sundays. Sometimes we work on Saturdays, right?
I work on weekends,
right? Yeah. But then Monday morning, I don't start till 2 p.m., 3 p.m. You may not work on a Monday, right? Like you do not get up. Like my first client is 10 a.m.
Sometimes you'll see me on a Sunday on a Wednesday.
Yeah, right? We have coffee. Like someone's like, why am I Wednesday afternoon? Like, because, you know, they likely are living these nonlinear lives too, right? But it is that, to me, this measurement of success nowadays when I don't have these milestones, because like the biggest shift career-wise was my one line that I had up until the last 3 years. I became self-employed, because you became self-employed much longer, probably 10 years. How long? 10 years?
8 years ago.
8 years ago. Okay, see, I have no concept of time. And so I became self-employed 3 years ago. And so for a long time, the nonlinear life that I was having in my personal life was still grounded with the fact that like I knew what my next promotion was going to be. I knew what my next pay step up would be.
When your paycheck was going to come.
What kind of job in the next 5 years, right? Like when my boss was going to retire, or when like this person was going to switch jobs and I would move up. And so nowadays, not having even that professional linear life that I'm following, right? Like it could have been another like spiral of like, am I doing this right? Am I in the right path? I know that I got questioned when I was leaving to come into private practice. I know that I get questioned around like how I'm doing this, right? By other colleagues who are a little bit afraid of the nonlinear life. And to me, it's just like, but I have so much choice. Like I love that I get to decide, like, you know, my wife is out of town this weekend and I'm just like, good, I'm going to work all weekend, right? Because I need to get some things out. And it might seem like counterintuitive that I'm excited to do things that seem like annoying, like things that people would be like most of the time, like, oh, look, I have to go to work. To me, it's just like, no, like I have things to do and I'm excited, but it is because of the choice of
absolutely
of having the ability to say, this is when I want to do it. And almost like the week doesn't feel like, I don't feel like sometimes I'm on the same week schedule that everybody else is in. It's like I make my own decisions about when do I work, when do I rest, when is too much, when is too little, and like adjusting. And I think like that is my biggest measurement of success.
That in itself also can be hard, like you were saying, how sometimes, and that is also something that I talk about, loving what I do and I love it. But it does also come with some things that are hard, right? So we talked about sometimes you don't know when I think for most part for your private practice, you know when you're going to get paid. For something like real estate or, you know, if you become a contractor, if you become, let's just say any kind of job that depends on a client or on a specific job, you might not necessarily know when your paycheck is going to exactly arrive. So that in itself does also come with a little bit of uncertainty and maybe some feelings there. And then also, and I think, again, we've talked about it where sometimes we want to have more people to hang out with during the week, right? Because I do a lot of things during the week because it's not as crowded. But again, having more friends that are not at work can also be hard, right? And so I like to talk about how great being self-employed is, but I love to be transparent about how it does, just like anything else in life, it also does come with some cons to it. Yeah.
Maybe that is like a good segue into talking about what have been some of those like challenges that you've had to face as you've chosen a non-linear life, both personally and professionally. What are some of those areas that maybe you have already overcome that felt like challenges, or some things that are still like in the you're still looking at them? Because I know that I have a couple of things that I'm looking at in a plate that fit with this like linear path, and so I'm like, what do I want to do about it? What have been some of those challenges that you've overcome or are in the process of like thinking about?
So I think overcoming a lot of the non-linear decisions that I've made over the last couple of decades, or really, I guess, throughout my life, is there's always going to be that feeling of maybe other. It gets easier with time. It 100% gets easier with time, but it's not always easy. In my professional life, something that has been hard, also because you are in a professional setting, so you can't always give, the answer that maybe you want to give. But me not having kids in a professional setting, believe it or not, has been really hard.
Really?
Yes. And for anyone listening, listen up. Maybe we can all learn from this. So in my day-to-day basis, I want to say that I service maybe 25 to 30% of either Spanish only or Spanish dominant clients. And one of the things that comes with that is that most people would expect someone that is married, someone of my age, to have kids. And I think that it just automatically comes to them as an expectation. And one of the things that happens in a professional setting, not only in Spanish, but is most people will ask, like, what did you do this weekend? Oh, do you have kids? Those are very common questions that people, when you first meet, will ask, right? Mm-hmm. You go to a networking event, maybe you go to a party where you don't know a lot of people. The first things they're going to ask, or the first things that I get asked a lot is, what do I do? Right? What do I do for a living? Oh, do you have kids?
See, I thought it was like a personal thing, but it's interesting that you're talking about it. That is in your professional life. This is showing up, huh?
Yeah. So it shows up in my personal life too, and I'll get into that next. But in my professional life, I think a lot of networking events now, not so much, because I feel like a lot of people already like know me, or when I go to a professional event, like they kind of already know, like, okay, no kids, no, we're not going to
ask about my kids.
Yeah. But in most settings, it's always, what do you do? Mm-hmm. And, do you have kids? Fine. But I've had some real interesting reactions from people when I tell them that I don't have kids, but specifically in the Spanish speaking community. I had someone tell me that I didn't know anything about life because I wasn't a mom. 100%. Like,
this is what not to say to people that are choosing a non-linear life.
Yes.
This is what not to say. This is this part.
Yes. So I think his exact words were, "Tú no sabes nada de la vida." And I was just like, I don't.
Letting me know. I
was like, I feel like I do. Right? And my response to that was, I know enough about life to know that that's not what I want, right? But it's hard because you're in a professional setting. So you can't be like, the fuck are you talking about? Right? Right? Like, that's the reality. So that has been, I also one time had someone, and this was years ago too, when I was a lot younger. I said I didn't have kids. And she said, "No quieres o no puedes." Like, those were her exact words to me. Like, I remember specifically because I thought,
you don't want to, you can't.
Because I literally thought, and I did tell her, like, I had to tell her just as a woman, as a human being, I had to tell her, I said, hey, as far as I know, I can have kids. But I'm going to tell you right now, that is a very hard question to ask someone. And I told her, I said, like, ¿qué tal si realmente no puedo y aquí me pongo a llorar? Right? Because imagine going through something and hearing that in your professional day, business. It's hard.
Because it has a judgment, right? Like, it has, like, are you going to judge me because I don't want to? Or are you going to feel sympathy with me because I can? But, like, why?
Exactly, yeah.
At the end of the day, why does that matter to you? And why do you need to do this and have this conversation?
Exactly.
Like, not to say this is what you don't say.
Yeah. And so, in a professional setting as well, and again, I had to tell her, and we had a little bit of a conversation about it, and it was because I really felt like for women out there in the workforce, to be asked these things. And if you're going through something, imagine what it can do. And here's the reality. Let's just say that you are having a corporate job and someone does ask you this, right? You get asked, is it because you don't want to or because you don't have kids? And then someone says, I can't have kids. And they break down.
Like, what are you prepared to do with what you just opened up?
Yes.
Because it's a sense of responsibility. Like, what an irresponsible sort of like thing to throw out there casually in the middle of somebody's day.
Yes.
Like, what is your responsibility when you are triggering or when you're opening up? Things are so personal and so potentially so painful.
Yes. And here's the reality, which I think it's even sadder, and it really bothers me when I think about it. If a woman was to break down at work, what's going to come from that? Do you think people are going to be like, you know what? Yes, take the day off. Clearly, you're going through something. Someone shouldn't have said this. And people...
You're too emotional.
Yes.
You're too emotional. Women are too emotional.
1,000%. That is the reaction that people are going to have. And yet people are still okay with asking so casually, do you have kids?
Yeah.
Why don't you have kids? And I have seen this. I have seen, I know women that have had cervical cancer, and I have seen people ask them, why don't you have kids? Mm-hmm. She's like, because I had cancer. It's just, so for anyone listening, I think having a family, having kids is something that can be talked about, and it's very common for people to ask, like, oh, do you have kids? Blah, blah, blah. Great. But we really need to be more careful, and we need to be more conscious about this question, specifically in the workforce, if you ask me. Like, well, I guess no one really asked me, but I'm telling you.
This is an opportunity to talk about it.
I'm going to tell you out there. I think it's something that people should really be aware of when they're asking. And I hope that, sharing my story, yes, it has happened to me. It's happened to me more than I like. These are just two stories that stand out. But I've lost track of how many times people have asked. And in a way, it does come with some judgment or that undertone of like, why?
Mm-hmm. Wow. Yeah, it makes me think, I think I get saved at the fact that I'm queer. People are not asking me this much, right? But even the assumption, right, that as a queer person, right, like I may not have a desire or may not have one. Like, it is so complicated to intrude in people's businesses, right? Like, at the end of the day, because I'm just like, dang, like, the audacity to like just think that you can have this conversation with a person because of your assumptions of who they are, or because you see a ring in someone's finger, or because they have been married for so long and like they're not having kids yet, right? Like, there is something about the respect for others' autonomy that we ultimately have the decision-making power to decide what's for us and what's not for us, and to choose some linear things and other ones are non-linear, and that choosing some linear things doesn't mean that then your entire life has to be prescribed. Correct. Like, it doesn't have to be that way. What about personally? How does this non-linear life show up for you?
Well, it has shown up in the past again, when we talked about getting married, kids, really, I feel like I have been asked about kids. I have lost track. I really have. One of the things that I like to point out, I guess this is PSA, public service announcement, everyone. Me not having kids doesn't mean that I don't like kids. Doesn't mean that I don't want to hear about your kids. I do. I do. I like kids, and in fact, the kids really like me.
You don't have a madrina to like a lot of children, because you are, which says that you are a trustworthy adult that can be responsible for the soul and caregiving of a child, were you to not be able to be there, right? So many people trust you with a lot of children, but there is this assumption, right, that you might not like kids, period.
Yes. And again, public service announcement to everyone out there, someone not having kids doesn't mean that we hate kids, doesn't mean that we don't like kids, doesn't mean that we don't want to be around kids. Yeah. I think that's one of the things that over the last couple of years has become something that I see personally, where I've had a couple people say like, oh, like I wasn't sure about the kids. Just like, no, like if like you want to bring your kid to something, or you want to invite me to like your kid event, like I will be there. Like if I'm able to be there, if it's something that I'm interested in attending, like I will be there. If I have other things, I might not. You know, it just depends. But don't assume that because it's a kid-related event, I'm going to be like, no kids.
I've been getting left out of some kids' events, and I'm like, I feel a certain type of way because I'm like, invite me. You know what I would do? I would paint your kids' faces. You know what I would do? I'll bring like the balloons or the cake or something, right? But it is, the assumptions of what does it mean when you've made a decision that is not a decision, like not something for you, but that doesn't mean all these other things that are assumed. A lot of assumptions.
Yeah, 100%. And there's events that I have that, yes, it's maybe like all girls or like adult events, but that doesn't mean that I don't want to go to a birthday party, that I want to go to a certain thing, right? That's just, I think that there's a lot of assumption that happens regarding if you don't have kids, that you don't want to be around kids. That's not the case.
Yeah, I think that in a personal, professional way, for me, like the nonlinear life, one is like that being left out, but also like some judgment around, am I still, for me, because I'm in social services, right? Like giving to people, like it is this like, am I still being of service to the world because I've chosen to not be like out in public and like this career that is like working very openly. Like I would do my work more private nowadays, well, not with the podcast and stuff, but like more like being a therapist. And so I think that I've gotten some judgment around like, am I still causing as much impact into the world because I've chosen to build my career now in a way that works for me versus in the way that it used to work for my employer, right? And so it is about, like for me, like affirming that my work is still good work, that my work is still valuable, that my work is still impactful. But it's just interesting how like the choices, having kids, being self-employed, like all these ways that are nonlinear, that like they carry a lot of judgment. I think ultimately that's kind of what we're trying to say. It's just like when you are living a traditional life and you're encountering people who are living a non-traditional life, how do you stay open to other people's experiences? And then not only open, but without imposing your values of things that work really well for you and that they may not work for somebody else, and not for bad reasons, just because of the choice that we get to have as we decide how to go about the world.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that's huge what you just said, because I think that it is important. It goes both ways. Me choosing to live a nonlinear life doesn't mean that I get to come and judge a linear life. If a linear life works for you, great. I love it. I'm here for it. Whatever is making you happy, I'm here to celebrate it. But I also want that celebration, right? And so when I think that's one of the biggest things to maybe take away from this is, at the end of the day, I'm living this nonlinear life because that's what I wanted for my life. And that's what makes me feel good. Doesn't mean that I think my life is better than a linear life. Just like anything in life, I think that there's pros and cons to a lot of things. And this is also one of them. But I like talking about it, and I'm more comfortable talking about it now that I've gotten older, because I do think that it deserves to be talked about. It deserves to be celebrated. And especially anyone that is younger, I want them to know that, one, you're going to be okay, but two, it doesn't have to always be linear. There's more to life than the linear path that we often see, that we often think that that's what we need to do.
And you get to choose. If you want some linear things, also great. And if there are some parts of you that are non-linear, that's also great. I think at the end of the day, it's that, right? Like, how do we let people be people with their choices and with their autonomy, and not be the voice that makes them shaky about what they're trying to do for themselves at the end of the day, right? Because al final del día no vas a pagar el bill, no me vas a dar, no me vas a apoyar. Like, you're not going to be like the one that is responsible for my nonlinear life. But the judgment, right, can be a hindrance and could be like a point. Maybe some of those words can be like what drives somebody into a low because they're feeling like hesitation or doubt from their environment about something that feels good for them. And so with this conversation, you know, and as we talked about, like, what are we going to talk in our interview? We could have talked about work. We could have talked about this. But I think that this conversation is sometimes hard to have with people that have a more traditional linear life. And there's also at times I have felt, and I don't know if you felt this, like a lack of interest on the nonlinear life, a lack of like, well, what are you up to? Like, what are you doing? Like, what is interesting to you? Because since I don't have like these things that maybe people automatically can talk about or relate to, then I have felt at times that then people just kind of like don't ask or are not curious or celebratory about what are the things that I'm doing because they look so different than the things that they're doing. You know, like for me, like this podcast is one of my new babies, right? Like I'm like constantly birthing ideas and birthing projects, right? But it's not the same as birthing a child. I'm very clear of that. But it is something that I put my love and my care and my soul into, right? And so I would like people to also be interested in those things the way that there is an expectation to be interested in linear life sort of situations or celebrations.
Yeah, no, I think that it's important, one, for us to have this conversation. I think it's also important to celebrate it. And I think that it's also important for people to speak up when it comes to maybe someone not being celebrated or someone being judged. I actually had a few years back, we were talking about, I think it was something like work related, and someone said that I didn't have a life. And then I had somebody else say, no, she's living the life she wants to live. Right. And I totally could have said that. And I say that very often. But to me, someone speaking up and someone saying like, you know, me working and doing something that I love is not having a life. Right. It's just the way that you mentioned this podcast is your project, something that you're putting 110% into. It's taken a long time to come to life, right? I know this firsthand. And so it's important to celebrate it, but also like, I feel if someone was to say like, oh, nothing's going on. No, there is a lot going on with you. You have a podcast. Tell me about it. So it's important for people to talk about it. But also if you're part of a conversation where you see it happening right before your eyes, I think it's important to also speak up.
I agree with that. I'm glad. I was a little bit, what? And then what a beautiful piece to have others advocate, because I think that particularly in the area of not having children, for me, one of the things that comes up is this kind of rhetoric that I have a lot of free time, or that I'm just like chilling and doing nothing. And I'm just like, no, I have a lot going on, right? Yeah. Do I sleep until 10 a couple times a week? Yeah, but I'm also working a lot, right? And so it's like this part of just like, I'm not busy in the traditional ways. I'm busy in non-traditional ways, and busy is busy and tired is tired. But there could be like some assumptions about what is it that our life looks like, or maybe it's just easy, or maybe it is just like not important. And it's hurtful. It's hurtful. And again, 2 decades later, be able to hear these things and be like, that's just people, right? But when I was younger, I know that I was more susceptible to those type of commentary where it was just like, like, am I doing the right thing, right? And so that's a part of the importance of this conversation for both the people that are living the nonlinear life to put that little un cuerito, an armor, you know, just to like protect yourself, because these comments are going to come and it doesn't make your decisions or the way that you're living life wrong. Right. But you may not have that affirmed inside of you yet. Like, okay, no, I am fine. I'm hearing this commentary, but I'm fine. And then for those who are living a traditional linear life and are in relationships with those who are making choices that are non-linear, how do you make space for us to, and to see us and celebrate us and acknowledge that our lives also have a lot of beautiful elements in them. And that sometimes well-intended words or careless words can, create like that damage even at some points in certain folks, right? And so just being mindful of that.
Let's be, what is it? Demure. Let's be mindful.
Judging people for their life choices. Very demure, very cutesy.
Very, very cutesy. We need to get that on a t-shirt. Not judging people on their life is very demure. 100% agree with what you just said, because it is important, right? It's important that, again, and this is for anyone living the nonlinear life, it's just knowing that the words, sometimes the questions can be hurtful, right? And so being mindful of either lifestyle or decisions or, whether someone decided to get married, not get married, have kids, not have kids, it's 100% their decision.
Change careers, not change, because the nonlinear life is in all aspects, and that's the thing.
It really is, yeah. It really is. And again, when I look at my life, some of it was decisions that I've made. And some of it, as we kind of talked about a little bit earlier, is some of those decisions were not made, right, by myself, right? I didn't choose to come here at 5 years old, right? But that really set the tone for the life that maybe I was going to encounter. And then later on, I made my own decisions, but it ultimately has led me here to this nonlinear life. And again, some of this is easier or harder for others. Some people could be like, I don't give a flying about
what, I don't care what anybody says or thinks. It's like, but some of us
do care. Yes. And I do think for me specifically, and I'm very comfortable talking about this because it is your podcast and you are a therapist, and it's not like a therapy plug. However, I am going to advocate for therapy as someone that, again, has been in therapy, is going to therapy, because it does help you find your true self and how to show up in a genuine way. And that gives you that confidence that maybe for some of us, where those words, those questions hurt a little bit more, to be able to still show up in that way and to be more confident with those decisions. So if you are listening and if you're or watching and you feel like you're not sure which way you want to go, therapy can help. Not that it's going to give you all the answers. And there's obviously a lot of work that comes with that, a lot of hard work, like I had mentioned. But really finding out who you are and what you want to do and what life you want to live, therapy can be an option to at least help you during those times, because it's not always going to be easy.
Yeah, and and from the therapist plug that I am going to make, as a therapist here, which is not a therapy podcast, but still a therapist me, that it is a space, I think, for many people. Like, I work with a lot of people that look like us, that have experiences similar to us, that have non-linear lives, right? And people that have a lot of linear lives. But like, what I find the value of therapy, both as a therapist, but as a person that's been in therapy, is that sometimes we haven't had the space to hear ourselves and our true thoughts about what we feel about these things, right? And so even having this conversation out loud, like, there would have been a time that I would have been uncomfortable, like, saying like, hey, y'all, like, this is how this is making me feel, because there is the worries, right, about how these things land. And so when you go to therapy, you get to have this uninterrupted, judgment-free space where you get to hear yourself talk about these things for the first time, process them, and then be like, dang, like, that's what's driving that? No, that's not what I want the driver to be, right?
Yeah.
Or like, oh, that's the driver of this action? Well, good. Like, I want to reinforce that, right? And so for many people, the therapeutic space can be sometimes the very first non-judgmental space that they encounter to really explore their nonlinear life or any other issue that is coming up for them. And so, and the second part that I would say, because of the sake of our friendship, our love, our sisterhood, our 2 decades of life that we've lived together, that having you as a friend that has a nonlinear life, when I'm also your friend that has a nonlinear life, like, has been vital. Yeah. It has been vital to have people in community, to be in community with people who get it and who are supporting you. Sometimes there's going to be people that are living in your life that can do that, but sometimes you're going to have to find people that are kind of in your wavelength too, so that you don't feel so alone, because that otherness, right, is something that we do navigate through different stages and ages. And so if you're living the nonlinear life, therapy and good friends that get it, you know?
Yeah. Or even if they don't get it, that they respect it. That's the biggest thing. You don't necessarily, because I think that I have friends in my life that probably don't get some of my decisions or like, what? But they respect it.
Yeah. Great point.
They respect it. They know this is who I am. They're okay with that. They're okay with me being in their life in this way that I am, right? And so, yeah, I think that's the other thing. Not necessarily have to get it, but can respect it. Right. So my last piece of advice for anyone having nonlinear thoughts, desires, is embrace the journey. It's not always going to be easy, like I have mentioned so many times today. So be gentle with yourself. Be gentle with yourself. Really be kind to yourself. Be the person to yourself that you are to others, because we're so good to other people sometimes that we forget to be just as good to ourselves. And lastly, celebrate it. Yeah. Celebrate the fact that you have decided this might not be for me, but this other life is.
Yep. Yay. So excited. I'm looking forward to people hearing this conversation. And so stay tuned for more Entre Tías y Amiguis as I introduce you some of my favorite people. And even like as you listen to the podcast, this is why I'm bringing it together, because there are some stories and sort of voices that I think we're not alone in having this conversation or these feelings, but you may be feeling alone. And so find your community. You know, I will put links on how to get in touch with Esthela, as well as I'll put some links for where to go find therapy if you're looking for a therapist.
Yes, 100%.
Keep living your best life. This is a wild ride. It's adulting thing. There is no manual for it. And so especially when you're living the nonlinear life. So be patient, love yourself, have a lot of compassion, and find some support, right? So until next time. Bye. If you enjoyed this episode, please subscribe, leave a review, and share with your tías and amiguis. Your support helps us reach more people and continue these important conversations. And don't forget to follow us on social media and stay connected. Until next time, remember to take care of yourself, embrace your journey, and keep living life with heart, vision, and creativity.